HR is an easy thing to think about because human capital is always a challenge. We're having a big transition in the workforce, big age changes, et cetera, et cetera. That's all going on. I think that's a little short-sighted. I honestly think, and I say this to a lot of people I talk to, is like, if your 2-year plan is not to move at least some of your business to an AI native, humanless, headless operational entity, then I'm not sure your strategy is aimed in the right direction. And I worry that your defensibility moat has gone. Here's the example I give everybody. If you are the CFO of a company and you have not put on your 2-year plan the ability for you to go entirely humanless in terms of how AR and AP are modeled, executed, and run, then you're going to be missing something because you don't need a human in those processes.
I'm here with my buddy Sultan Meg G. And, we're on a new platform today, so there might be a little bit of hiccups that we end up coming after. But it's a wonderful day to be talking about the future of AI forward organizations and like what that means for business, what it means for life, just in general. And so once again, man, thank you for coming on, and always appreciate our conversations.
Hey man, it's great to see you. It's been such a hot minute. Like
Yeah,
it's been like a week. So
exactly.
no, it's so I love the genesis of this conversation in this episode because for those who are listening, Don and I have these regular meetings, and it's usually towards the end of the day. It's usually when we're in the flow state, but the critical thinking starts to fall off a little bit, and we end up going down all these amazing rabbit holes. And the one that triggered today's is one that has hit my frontal cortex 6 or 7 times in such radically different environments over the last 60 days that when we were talking, you called it. You're like, we just need to record this conversation. And so, I'm really excited about it because the future of AI forward organizations is such a marketing buzz silliness right now. I mean, it's everywhere, right? It's
Oh, yeah.
it's all the legacy platforms, et cetera. But the fact is like I was talking to one of the largest growth funds on Monday, and it became a fundamental discussion around the future of their business. I was talking to a GSIB at the executive level last week. Same conversation, totally different context. Was talking to a government agency about something they're trying to accomplish. Same thing. And everyone is seeing that AI native or AI forward organizations are going to operate fundamentally differently than existing organizations. And but nobody's figured out yet the angles on it. And so in the world that Don and I live in, we've seen the agency model, we've seen the product model, we've seen the platform model, we've seen blank as a service. And the thing that I'm spending a lot of time thinking about is what is an agent native business look like? Or what does a business where you are selling yourself as a company, like from like you're a PE portfolio company and you're being sold or you're selling yourself, and you have to defend the moat of your business. And there are a number of firms out there that have fundamentally said there is no moat, right? Which I think is an
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating thing to say. Is there is no moat? It's just the outcome. Can you get to a better margin? And the noise around this is just fascinating.
I think that I kind of feel like there's a different moat than there was in the past. We've talked about memory, we've talked about workflows, the idea that like, hey, your big four consulting firms, like they used to hold this like knowledge book that was like, how do you apply this to every business? And then you can go in there and they have that repository where that is no longer really applicable since we all have that endless bit of information at the end of our fingertips with the LLM now and can apply it to our own space. It's almost as if the next bit of stickiness is now memory and context of your usage patterns of how you are behaving in these spaces.
Yeah.
And I think this is the new moat to be discovered because before 2008, we never would have discussed attention as like the thing that would drive consumer behavior in the compute space. But that really hit on everything that was advertising and really drove that market. And I think today we're seeing the big four kind of like fight for that. I want to get you on my platform and I want to keep you there perspective. So
It's so this is such a fascinating conversation because this is now the third, I would call it, fundamental internet technology failure of the 1990s that has come back. Okay. So there was one, which was Ginny and the RMI and the Gin and all of the specs that went into what became the Java ecosystem in the late 90s. And the whole point was to create ubiquitous interconnectivity amongst all these different services that you could then access through whatever hybrid endpoint you want. Well, that is agents plus MCP plus APIs plus all the stuff that you see inside of a Claude Cowork or something like that. I'll skip the second one because it's a cybersecurity thing. But the third is this exact thing. It is the fact that there was something called X509, which you will still see in internet specifications. But what was implemented and what's actually in the spec and in the internet today is a tiny, tiny percentage of what the original discussion was. It's a great history lesson, which other people are far better at telling than I am. But one of the things into the original thesis of X509 as a spec was that you could include preferences. My preferences, a computer's preferences, a platform's preferences. And when I think about that conversation and I think about today, I just think about markdown files in Obsidian. Like that's all it is, right? You use centralized cloud resources to drive synchronization where you need to. You use federated to run the workflows, to have the preferences flow to the places they need to flow. There is always a single source of record or multiple sources of record if you're a blockchain human. And then you have these endpoints, whether they are edge devices, our phones, the the lighting system in my house that knows my calendar and knows to turn the lights on when I'm gone at a certain time, and to randomize it and stuff like that. And so now there's this unbelievable content and data creation process going on related to preferences. And if you think about what Karpathy did with the LLM wiki knowledge base thing a few weeks ago, and I'm saying a few weeks ago just because I know when this is going to come out versus when we're actually having the conversation, right? You look at some of the memory functions, open source projects that have gotten news in the last few weeks. What we're doing is fundamentally saying these agentic systems, no matter what form they are, whether it's running on my framework desktop on a cron job at 3 o'clock in the morning or something else, they all are going to have some or all of my preferences at their fingertips. I say, oh, by the way, I want to wake up and have a dossier on every person I'm talking to that is texted to me 5 minutes before every meeting. Well, do you know how long it took me to activate that for myself? It took me about 5 minutes, right? And so now not only is preferencing ubiquitous, but the ability to drive value out of it is also hyper commoditized and ubiquitous.
We're going to basically the price of intelligence is going to zero.
Yeah, for a certain value of intelligence. Right? I mean,
Yeah,
there's still, I think, and we'll talk about mythos in a second, which I think does alter that conversation just a little bit,
yeah.
and when we think about the arc that the Anthropic organization is on right now, I think they've definitely altered at least how I measure computational intelligence.
That's an interesting statement there as far as like how you measure computational intelligence.
Yeah.
And what do you mean by that?
So I don't measure it by CPUs. I don't
No, not at
measure it
all.
by any of the accuracy measures that people have been using for LLMs because that's totally plateaued. And the accuracy is strictly based on the amount of computation you give them and the iterative factor of training that they've done. Right?
Right.
There's nothing else special there. You have to now think about it in a different metric. And so for our enterprise clients, it's about outcomes. And there are two halves to that, right? One is where the opportunity set is, whether it's TAM or margin or whatever, that a company isn't executing consistently, reliably, repeatably on because they're using people instead of technology. Which, by the way, this is the first time we can say that with absolute certainty that that's a measure of a company now. And then the second is that how the technology, how easily it can be applied to that to drive to an outcome. So, for example, in our financial services work, we see a lot of companies that are, let's say, between 5 and 10 years old, where their margins, their EBITDA margin is in the 40s, right? If you and I were to go off and build a competitor to that company, the floor margin would be in the 70s, right? And we have never seen that kind of evolution happen where the fundamental improvement is by removing humans. And so the example I gave is the Ford CEO, when they were starting to go down the electric car path, they bought a Tesla and disassembled it. And they looked at the length, like how many feet of electrical cabling was in a Tesla. And it was like 10% or something. I've got that number wrong, but it was a tiny percentage of what was in a Ford, or what the engineers at Ford had tried to design. And it's because clearly a human did not design part of that. A human said, listen, how do we optimize for X, Y, and Z? And they did it. Now, car makers using machine learning and AI is not new. In fact, one can argue that most of the interesting stuff that happened from kind of 1975 to 1990 was Toyota using machine learning in their manufacturing processes. But that's a different part of history, right?
Yeah.
But this notion of measuring the value and measuring the intelligence of a system, I think to me is, can I drive a better margin or a better efficiency or a better unit of work? If something costs me $100 per unit of work today, I should be able to get it to 7 to 10 within a year by going AI forward. And that is, by the way, a baseline that we've validated a couple of times, like personally. And so to me, it is the fact that we live in a capitalist system that becomes the lever of measurement for the value of artificial intelligence, is through a capitalist lens.
I could definitely see that. And then the other side of this is, you still basically need the human to kind of like drive some of the system. And I know that we're stepping further and further away from that. And like even in our own business, like we've automated a good portion of our dev pipeline. And then over the last week, we've improved that by 5x just in the matter of like 7 to 14 days around what we could do with that. And so now we're just figuring out like what is the absolute limit of speed that we should be doing that our customers can actually embody and use from our platform, right? But
Mhm.
then again, the other side of this is I see that the human behavior operates at one speed, the agent's behavior operates at a whole different level of computational efficiency and or intellectual efficiency at that matter as well, that we're now getting to the point where having a human in the loop is a problem for errors that get introduced, and additionally for the time that it takes the person to get engaged in the problem as well. So where
Yeah.
do you see that playing into,
Oh,
business as a challenge here?
this is where I will try not to do my standard. This is why a single model to rule them all is not the right way to do this, because if you're constantly doing continuous learning on single model infrastructures, the risk
Yes.
factor just gets through the roof. Too dangerous. The opportunity of, all of these systems hallucinate, all of them get confused, all of them are struggling, but that's a separate function. The actual function is, where is the value derived from picking one of those learning models over the other? So, for example, we just updated our pricing, and the iteration on learning is now basically a drop down menu. You pick: do you want continuous? Do you want weekly, monthly, quarterly? And that changes your pricing. Because, especially in regulated markets, like where we do a bunch of, like broad payments work, for lack of a better categorical structure, because of how that has to be reported to the regulators and others, like that can't change too often. Or you have to be far more descriptive and explainable in what it does. So you have to be really direct. You have to say, this data with this math came to this answer, right?
Yes.
And that's fine. But if you're changing the math every 3 weeks or every day, then do you really, we're not doing it in the US right now because we live in a non-prescriptive regulatory environment. So you don't have to get approval for a model from a central authority. But to our friends in Europe, to our friends in the People's Republic of China and other jurisdictions, they might have to. And so I do find, as a total tangent, it interesting to see where regulated markets versus non-regulated markets in the United States versus all markets in Europe because they're all fundamentally regulated versus in other parts of the world in other political environments are hyper structured, and just how different those solution sets are looking, because you're actually seeing models built for different value propositions, and therefore you have to use different measuring sticks of effectiveness and intelligence.
Which is interesting because I've seen a lot of people using the wrong model for the wrong job and then claiming that it's a complete failure. But at the same time, it's figuring out that value prop of where does that model fit in. Are you like, we're coming to this concept of, our AI really isn't a spend of the technology organization, it's a spend of HR, and kind of like looking at where, you're actually applying intelligence in your workflows, in your spaces as well. What's your take on that?
I mean, I hate to say this, but I feel like we're in like the, I'd say at the end of the first quarter of a football game, right? Oh, HR is an easy thing to think about because human capital is always a challenge. You want to simplify it, et cetera, et cetera. We're having a big transition in the workforce, big age changes, et cetera, et cetera. That's all going on. I think that's a little short-sighted, honestly. I honestly think that, and I say this to a lot of people I talk to, is like, if your 2-year plan is not to move at least some of your business to an AI native, humanless, headless operational entity, then I'm not sure your strategy is aimed in the right direction. And I worry that your defensibility mode will go away very quickly. So here's the example I give everybody. If you are the CFO of a company and you have not put on your 2-year plan the ability for you to go entirely humanless in terms of how AR and AP are modeled, executed, and run, then you're going to be missing something because you don't need a human in those processes. It is, am I invoicing? Am I charging the credit cards? Am I, paying people on time and stuff like that? And those are all highly scheduled, highly structured API driven activities for most organizations. The minute I have a little bit of free time, I will implement an agentic system that manages AR and AP with absolutely no work on anyone's hand other than I get asked to confirm I want to send an invoice, or I want to send a check, or I mean, not to send a check, but like send the wire or whatever. Like we will get to that place. I'm kind of hoping our ERP vendor does that, but ERP vendors are not exactly the fastest movers in this space.
Which also brings me to another idea that we're also kind of, every small business is feeling the brunt of technology fragmentation. And I'm even thinking of like small, medium sized enterprises as well. Like, you have a specialty tool for everything that you do. The vendor probably sells you on 80% of what it does, and you use 10% of the actual tool just to fit that niche use case of your business that you need it for. Every tool is getting AI added to it. And like, I understand from this, from our QuickBooks, our Zero, like our ERP solutions on that side, that it makes sense for them to be adding, the agents there. They're, anything that's accounting, like, we have entirely outsourced, right? Like, there are certain aspects of the business that we all feel good outsourcing those components, and makes sense for that to be in another platform. Are there things that are core to your own business that just widely need to be AI agentic for you, for the platform, for yourself to be operating, and that you can't really bring a consultant into the equation?
I mean, and this gets to, I think, the meat of, if I was the CEO of a company listening to this conversation, I'm like, okay, Don and Sultan have been talking for like 20 minutes and I've heard nothing tangible that I can take home. Well, here, let's move to that part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Number one, as has been true since I think Jack Welch might have said it originally in the 80s, 80% of every business is exactly the same and entirely commoditized. There's 20% that is competitively differentiated. And it could be your sales model, it could be the products you offer, it could be how you approach a market. I mean, there are a million ways where that 20% can be exposed. I think you go back to basics and say, if I was starting this company from scratch in 2027, what would I not even consider hiring someone to do and instead hire a orchestrator? And that orchestrator is a combination of a human and technology. And that person has a list of all the things that the company has to do in order to make money so everyone gets paid at the end of the month. And you work backwards from that. And I think there are a lot of industries, and I will highlight insurance as probably one of the biggest opportunity sets right now. I think financial services is up there. I think, there are a bunch of others. But any kind of human plus technology business where the fundamental outcome is a triggering of an action in a third party or some sort of quantitative financial measurement, I think we'll discover that a huge amount of that market just turns over completely. And so a few years ago, I got on the stage at a big equities conference in New York and made the case that I think we'll see 50% turnover in the S&P 500 in the next 10 years. So I think we're either 2 or 3 years into that 10-year window. I would not be at all surprised if we get there far sooner than that, given the pace of change.
Yeah. I can't disagree with you. Like if you look at the amount of growth that's being driven by technology sector right now in the S&P 500, it's basically what driving 80% of growth,
Something like that, yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. And then you're bound to have other companies fall off because they're just not keeping up. And so, yeah.
Well, or you have a company like Anthropic, which is like, oh, well, because we instrument everything you type into those systems, they analyze and look at. They've just launched, in the last month, they just launched like a huge PE function to go help people, PE funds, analyze their portfolios better and then recommend actions inside of the portfolios. Well, great. That has just wiped out a number of consulting firms' value propositions, right? If you're an Alex Partners or a Bain or a Deloitte or someone like that, all of a sudden you're kind of you're kind of fighting with something because that business for them will be a high margin business of which the delivery is so low that not only is it a higher margin business, but they'll also be able to charge less eventually. They're not doing it right now. I mean, I heard someone say that Perplexity is charging 20 million for one of these engagements, which I think is quite rich. The $1.5 million Deloitte contract that turns into a PowerPoint, I think we're not going to see a lot of those. I think you'll see a lot of 150K agency style contracts. And I think you and I have both seen a bunch of those where it'll be 150K agency contract. You get a prototype of an AI thing and a nice presentation. Okay, great. That was 2025. That's not what 2026 is. That agency model is really not sustainable, right? Remotely.
No. I think
And
that the
so,
tooling is becoming a lot better in order to make it much more
yeah,
feasible for people to be doing that on their own. But
yeah,
also, we're now looking at how do you get more work done? How do you take action upon the things that you're doing? So the
yeah.
research of your business is that 2025 model.
Well, and hopefully, and I hope a lot of people learned this because of the failures of so many of those POCs in 2025 and even into early part of 2026, is they understand that you have to fundamentally insource that analysis, right? And this is where I think you really discover the bell curve model of human capital management in large and medium enterprises is now fundamentally shifted. We use an inverse bell curve at my company, right? So
Right.
age is the x-axis, domain, count of people is the y-axis, right? There we have a bunch of people in their 20s and we have a bunch of people over 45. And guess what? Everyone over 45 has had to turn themselves into an AI native executive or contributor, right?
Yeah.
I have the person who's fundamentally responsible for customer success in financial services. That person is playing around with Claude Code. That person is, just got a new Mac and she's doing stuff with open code and she's, doing all this stuff. And she was able to the other day, and it was mind blowing. She came out of a meeting with a customer that had been recorded because it had a bunch of feature options and stuff like that. She fed it into running locally on her Mac, open code plus a llama plus I can't remember which open source model she used. And she generated in essence, a prototype of what the new UI was going to have to look like to fit what the customer had just asked for. She did that in 45 minutes, 2 weeks into installing Claude Code. And she's a very, very bright person, really good at it. But what does that do? When that kind of capability is at everyone's fingertips, the agency model struggles, the consulting model struggles because you don't need them for any of this. And when there's data ubiquity at the same time, it's now all of a sudden not can I do it? It's what do I do first? What creates the most value and how do I drive that kind of incentivization of value activity? And that to me is the most interesting conversations right now is because everybody thinks, oh, I can hit my back office and drive a lot of efficiency. Well, you can to a degree, and it's a good starting point. It's a safe starting point, but it's really the orchestration of your overall business. Like, are you in a position where the system can go out, find you a customer lead, and drive it, let's say 90% of the steps to revenue without a human actually being involved? I think the most interesting thing I'm waiting to see, and I have not seen it yet, is a venture capital firm or a PE firm or someone like that who fundamentally bakes in that kind of AI transformation as part of their acquisition or investment in a company and says, listen, we're going to pay, we're going to alter the spreadsheet we've not altered in 30 years because we want to put X millions of dollars into that transformation on the assumption that really what you're doing is you're buying revenue and you're buying a stable balance sheet. And then over 2 years or 6 months or 3 years or whatever, let's definitely half the lifetime that it's in the fund, they can then turn around and alter how that organization looks to become the AI native version of itself and not wait for the competitor to come and become a threat. And then use that to go after everyone else.
I think we're going to definitely see that. I know I've talked to a few funds that are
I,
intrigued in being down that way, but
I think every fund I've talked to in the last 6 months has talked about it.
yeah,
I think I will be curious to see who gets to the execution side of
it,
that first.
it's a very difficult time frame to or kind of thing to hit. And I remember talking to a guy 2 years ago now. He was the champion of going in and gutting IT organizations. And he goes, I don't, conflict doesn't bother me, is basically what it is. And so when you're entrenched in spending, $50 million a year on your IT budget, this guy comes in and says you can do it for five. You've got to get through a lot of people to make sure that you can actually hit those windows. So um, it is going to take a very special breed of people who are able to run through and do that work. Because it is,
It's
it's an organizational change management kind of perspective, and it's going to take a lot of strategic decisions that need to be made and definitively made.
well, and they're not small decisions either. And I think that's the thing that I really hope people listening and people who are considering these conversations in 2026 realizes 90% of the pilots from 2025 in AI
Yeah.
really didn't do anything. The organizations that implemented Copilot in their Office 365 environments, I think the average is 3% utilization or something like that. I think that number came out a few months ago. Those are not useful programs fundamentally. You've got to be focused on a strategic outcome. So if you're a fund, it's okay. I'm buying a company knowing I'm going to sell it. So what has to be true 5 years from now when I sell it, and how do I make it more compelling of a sale? So that's getting a better multiple, that's having a better customer position, it's a higher efficiency, lower time to revenue, right? These are not new things. These are just effective business operational metrics that are strategic, to your point, right? If I have someone send me a spreadsheet that shows about like a 47 step process that has a KPI against every step in the process, I'm just gonna be like, come on, guys. Or if I hear about like how people are using pods to effectively reallocate workload, like those are great, but that is not how you go AI native. And it might work for you today. I'm not sure it's going to work for you in 2 or 3 years.
An interesting perspective because I'm constantly going through this evolution of, I mean, there was, I think, an Anthropic report that was released maybe a month or two ago that basically described like most organizations that implement AI successfully hit like either a 3% productivity hit all the way down to like a 64% productivity hit before they see the benefit.
Yeah.
And I've been on both sides of that equation. of seeing 3%, seeing 64%, kind of going through evolutions where you are hitting balances there. But like what are you seeing for organizations that are going through this, AI first type of implementation?
It's really, I wish I could say there was, one standard model and one standard outcome. But I would
Yeah.
say, there's a company that we work with, and their initial, when we were going in and doing kind of the basic scoping and all this kind of stuff, we were trying to get to a certain unit of work measurement. And the industry, we knew what the industry average was, which was between 60 and $80 per unit of work. And that the human capital cost all in per hour for someone doing that work is about 165. Okay, so we knew two numbers, one range and one actual number. And so we worked backwards and said, what would make this such a no brainer of a project for them? What if you could cut 50%? So going from 165 to 82, right? So you hire a different category of people, you give them different training, they work on different things. You in essence lower the complication of that role. So you go from a kind of a more premium hire to a less premium hire, right? Okay, great. That was just optimizing for solutioning. So only the really hard stuff got to the 165 people and a lot of the sillier stuff. So that was a structural workflow optimization program more than anything else. The other one, that 60 to $80 per unit of work, we said, well, what's the real number? And they said, well, if we get it to 50, I'd be really excited. And I'm like, what about 40? And they're like, oh my God, 40 would be like amazing. I'm like, okay. And so we went in and we did the math, we figured it out, we engineered a system, and it's not and it's $7 per unit of work with a track to 4. And if they do some other things that are kind of a little more structural in terms of the organization, so they have certain legacy tech platforms and stuff like that, we think they could get it to 2. Well, guess what? That became a really easy sale for us,
Oh yeah.
right? And it's still a super high margin business for us. It's not, the north of 80% margin business for us. And so I think we're going to see a lot of people having to think about problems like that. Like, what's the per unit of work measurement? What's the actual human capital investment in getting that unit of work done? And I think when people talk about mid-level white collar employees being the most impacted by AI, I think that's absolutely correct. And I just, it's good, but it's got to be run by the business. Most IT organizations are not prepared to do this, and it's so threatening to them. Because in so many organizations, it's what's your budget? What's your budget authority as an executive, and how many people do you have working for you? I was just as a kind of a funny side story, I was talking to the COO of a top 20 bank not too long ago, and they couldn't get over the fact that we didn't have like 10,000 employees in our company. And I'm just like, I don't need them. Like, I would rather have 50 very smart, sharp people who actually are AI natives than 250 of whom 10 are AI natives.
Yeah.
The problem is there's just not that many in the workforce. And most of the people who are wired for that kind of thing don't want to go work for insert big megacorp.
Was in a conversation the other day that definitely reiterated some of your points right there, that it was, like where are you putting your platform, right? And I was like, look, I honestly like the startups, I like the small businesses, because whenever we work with an organization that uses our agentic platform and you start using it amongst teams, you have so much bureaucratic overhead that you have to get through in order to make decisions or make changes, that the tool is much more effective with smaller teams. They can run a lot faster.
I'm just curious in the larger organizations, because we've seen an interesting bifurcation in the market. Do you notice a big difference between public and private organizations?
I think my private organizations tend to be able to hold like a little bit longer of a window before they can see the absolute benefit of something. The public organizations kind of have a little bit different tint to it, but I don't really have a strong indication either way. Are you seeing?
A massive difference. I would
Really?
say, oh yeah, I think so. So I'll just talk about healthcare and financial services markets because those are two of our bigger ones. I would say that at least 60, if not 70%. I'm sorry, I should have looked this up. I was thinking about this before we got on this on the pod. At least 60, if not 70% of our clients that closed the sales cycle in under 120 days were privates.
Okay.
And so they were willing and able to execute faster. And because of the rigor of being a private company, whether owned by a local shareholder community or owned by a private equity firm or whatever, they had a far more granular sense of outcome and value and where the levers that they were wanting to pull were to move the numbers for the firm. And that might be part of the macroeconomic regime we're in right now, where there's a lot of uncertainty about things. You know, obviously this Iran thing has been on everyone's mind for the last few months. There's a lot of questions about, you know, kind of fundamental macroeconomic things. You know, I will be curious if between when we record this and when it comes out, if the private credit situation has exploded in a really bad way. I kind of feel like it would have, so
Yeah.
I hope it doesn't. But you know, consumer debt is at its highest level ever. You know, there's a bunch of different moving pieces there that I think a lot of people are trying to move through. I also just think from a timing perspective, if you think about COVID and you think about the fundraising cycle for private funds, you know, there are sequences and you'll see these waves of transactional activity. And I think we're in a certain part of one of those waves right now.
It's definitely an interesting time. I also, some of the things that I want to highlight about what you've talked about is really finding the value proposition, the unit of work that is being done, and being able to measure the cost of that, because that's going to be the value prop for whatever solutions that you end up providing. And this kind of goes into the whole idea of, uh, in any recession, if you're selling copiers, kind of like sell the value of it, like of, taking that. I can't remember the exact concept that was done, but selling the service of it, selling the per unit cost instead of leasing the entire thing, so that you actually help to minimize the effect, or being the consultant that comes in and says, "Hey, you know what? You're spending way too much money on these service areas. We'll take the savings of that off."
Yeah.
Um, that's a really clean kind of concept to bring into the idea for. I'm trying to think of organizations where it may not be that easy to measure what the actual work product is. I mean, not even that the work product is, but what the actual per unit cost, because it may be one of many different work products, especially in like a knowledge worker type
Yeah.
environment. Any recommendations for those industries?
Oh man, it's such an interesting problem. We see a lot of tech-enabled services businesses where it's
Yeah.
fundamentally a services business, and you know, in a lot of ways, it doesn't look any different today than it did 20 years ago, right? They're just using more tech. So let's say it's an environmental services firm, so they're using better sensors, right? They're using wireless sensors. They're using drones to get samples instead of having to climb up a smokestack, you know, stuff like that, right? You see that one is a struggle because and this is probably overrepresented in certain environmental situations and certain, but the regulatory environments are, even in the environment we're currently in here in the US, the regulatory environments are not as flexible for the impact of these technologies as possible. Here is a great example. There are a variety of forms that one must fill out in a variety of different regulatory structures, both at the state and federal level in the United States, whether in financial services, environmental, healthcare, energy, where you have to list a fax number. And it's not an optional field, right? When was the last time you had like a business critical fax come in, Don?
I feel like a decade ago. Yeah.
Yeah, mine was on Monday
Nice.
because I got a fax from a regulatory body. And so we we have this one of those stupid services and they faxed it to me and then I get a PDF. And I'm like, okay, great. Well, this was totally useless and I don't understand why you couldn't just email it to me. And then I get the argument that I love, especially from people who are used to fax machines, is like, well, it's more secure than email. I'm like, it actually isn't, right? Like the signal that goes down a phone wire on a fax is not actually secured in any way, right? It's an open standard, which is how you can have a variety of different fax machines. So if you're being, your phone line is compromised, then guess what? They can read it. Just like just like email is not secure. Like, don't think for a second that every email you send can't be read by bad guys. Of course they can,
Oh, absolutely.
right? But again, this is, I don't want to go down the digital literacy path, but I do think that part of this evolution right now is going to see a huge percentage of people just leave the workforce because they've never turned the corner on the digital literacy part of the conversation. And now going from, well, I'm not really sure how to use my ERP very effectively to, oh, now I have to audit an agent that's actually running the ERP for me. Like that, I would not be at all surprised to see a decent little wave of people leaving the workforce because of that.
We are. There are people who are basically choosing early retirement than choosing to go through another technology innovation cycle. Um, it is an interesting time, and also like you and I are in the same kind of hiring bell curve as far as that reverse thing. Either you're on the very beginning of your career or you are 45 and older and you have an AI native kind of mindset. But it does take that mindset of you've got to jump into the tech and you really want to see how you can solve almost all of your problems using AI in some form or fashion and really understanding where the boundaries of it can be.
It's an incredible evolution we're in right now, and I think so many of our peers in this universe, Don, that I've lived in, are going to self-select out.
Yeah.
And and that's disappointing because probably some of the biggest advantages to really effective businesses right now are the people with significant domain experience who finding ways to continue to participate in this highly digital
Well,
evolution we're going in.
and I think, where you and I have probably both succeeded is taking the strength and the thing that we know and then using AI to further advance that evolution of where we're at. Like, I mean, while we've been sitting here, I think I just saw that our fifth PR was literally closed automatically just in the last like half an hour, right? Like,
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
built that pipeline out because we know SDLC. We know what needs to be done, each of the steps, and you can take a model and you can say, all right, well, this is your role, your responsibility. Now we're going to have a supervisor that, like, all of that kind of comes together. But like if you take somebody from a finance background, they wouldn't have been able to do what I did with it, and vice versa. Like I can't take the finance side of it and fully extend out what can be done. But the people on the team that have that expertise are able to take the same tools and create those processes and really manage teams of agents that are doing that work. Um, what's the one thing that you would recommend to anybody who's kind of sitting on the sidelines knowing that they need to take action, or like what are what's the next three steps that we all need to be looking at?
Honestly, it's finding those voices of people who look like you, act like you, have the same kind of roles, who are a couple of steps further down the line,
Yeah.
and find them and just see what they're doing. You and I are fortunate because of the communities we live in. There are a variety of places for us to go to observe. And I have an agent that goes out and knows certain people to look at on social media and knows certain GitHub repositories. And I get those updates as it goes, right? For people in the investment community, it's so fascinating because there is still such a human component. There's a very large, very well known research firm in the equity side, and they have a variety of different markets they evaluate. Some of them very well, some of them not so well. And the ones that do very well, I make sure I get a copy of every single research report. And it's ingested into my little equities agent, and it's continually learning, and it's building and doing all this great stuff. Well, guess what? Every PM at every hedge fund and every asset manager in the world should have a version of that system running on their laptop, right? If you don't, you're going to be on your back foot in about 6 months. because there are going to be firms that are going to be offering that as services, and hopefully your 2 and 20 support hiring them. If not, there's going to be an entirely next generation of funds that do that. And so figuring out if you're an organization that can make this transition, just from a human, kind of a human perspective, from a shareholder perspective, that's job one. And you shouldn't be sad or embarrassed if you know that you're not in that 20% that can, because I really do think it's only probably 20%. It's just how long is the tail going to support the other 80%? I think in some markets that tail could be a decade, but in other markets, I think we've seen it, that tail could be 90 days if you're not careful. Like, how many SEO agency shops do you think will actually exist by the end of 2026? 20% of what currently exists?
Yeah,
Maybe,
yeah.
right?
There's but also I see some of them making the transition to saying that they can get you in ChatGPT, right? Like they're shifting, but also I was talking to somebody who's, paying thousands of dollars a month for SEO services and literally did the work of an SEO company within a month using Claude and saw the immediate benefit of what they were doing. And so they didn't see anything from the agency for 6. So yeah, 20% sounds actually generous right now.
Yeah. It's funny. There are just so many people, so many of these agency type jobs. And I would argue that SEO digital agency is a perfect example of that. I think you see it on the software side. I think you see it in a bunch of others. But the fact is we are at a moment where the tooling that we have, it's not just the best that's ever existed. It's an order of magnitude better than what existed 2 years ago. And a year from now, it will be an order of magnitude better again, right? You think about the first iteration of the jokes that we called vibe coding from like a year ago, and you then look at the quality of work coming out right now. It's a huge evolution. This recent Project Glassdoor that got announced, that is a perfect example of, obviously they're not going to release that model to the public because, good lord, that would be terrifying if they did. But taking it and turning it into a direct value creation exercise that just immediately happens. And from the minute that they started the project to the minute they had the proof point to the minute they started submitting feature fixes and bug fixes into open source projects, that was less than 6 weeks, right? I can't imagine, knowing some of the companies I know, that they could even remotely come close to that. And so here's the outlier for me. Every single person listening to this should have a plan and should know how far along the post quantum encryption journey they are on. Okay, that's a very straightforward thing. At some point between now and some point in the future, there will be an existential threat to all encryption systems out there from quantum computers. A research report just came out, I want to say it'll be a month or so ago at this point, that talked about the number of qubits needed to break Bitcoin. Because at some point that will happen, probably in the next 5 years. And every Bitcoin wallet will be drained, which is why it's hard for me to get super excited about things like the Clarity Act, if that's even made it to market at this point. I don't know. We'll see. Because, okay, great, but if you can't secure that system and you can crack every wallet, then, if ECDSA gets taken out by quantum, then Bitcoin disappears as an asset class, right?
Yes.
Well, the minute you can do that, all of a sudden every other encryption system is up for grabs, right? So if you're listening to this and you're not sure about the effort it takes to get there, that's a great use case for AI, is to understand your actual technical risk exposure. Use AI to walk across your infrastructure and find out the answer to that question. Like we do that. Like we run continuous audits. I get updates, bug fixes when 0 days happen. I get the email, everything. But I got to tell you, like, I don't get credit for that in our SOC 2 at all. Like, that gets an almost it's a 90% automated process on our side. But the way the SOC 2 system works is I don't get extra credit for that.
No, no, it's check the box.
Yeah.
But it's becoming an absolute necessity to be able to do that, because especially with the Project Glassdoor or Mythos, it's it's becoming you have to be. making sure that you are understanding every single, either exploit or having processes that actually can remediate it quicker and quicker. So it's a very unique space that we're at, but you're also, hitting on a highlight of the quantum problem that we all face, and that everything that we do today is a non-quantum kind of like function of the world. Um, Either way, man, I got to say, I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us. I think we've got both a nice dynamic of theoretical, fun little conversation, and then also a bit of practical that is mixed in with it as well. So, once again, Sultan, I really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me, man. This is fun. We always go places. I always feel like these can go an extra 20 or 30 minutes, but the metrics on that aren't great for the podcast.
That's exactly it. And also, it clues people in that we're probably going to have more conversations anyway. So,
Yeah.
I
Awesome.
dig it,
Well, hey
man.
man,
Thank you.
always good to talk to you.